Hope you had a good lunch. We're back, moving right along. We have a talk now from Professor Jari Kaukua from the University of Jyväskylä. And he is going to present a paper on mind and mental existence in Avicenna. Welcome, Jari.
Thanks a lot, Stephen, and thanks to Stephen, Katharina, Chris for having me here and for taking such good care of me and us for so far at least. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to do three things, or at least try to do three things. First, I will contextualize Avicenna's concept of mental existence, which I think is probably the closest you can find to a notion of the life of the mind in him, by discussing the role of this concept in his epistemology, which I think is foundational for this concept, or the central context for this concept. Secondly, I will turn to psychology and to the question of what properties the human mind and its existence must have in order for the concept of mental existence to fulfill this epistemological role. And then third and finally, I will look into two fundamental problems in Avicenna's theory, which, as disappointing as these problems may be for the card-carrying Avicenist, may perhaps provide some further light for his theory, into his theory of the human mind. So although there probably will not be that much life in the beginning of the talk, I hope it will become a little bit more vivid as we proceed. But as I said, Avicenna introduces the concept of mental existence in a logical context, or an epistemological context, when he discusses the kinds of predicable quiddity and their logical properties, such as universality and particularity. And in the very beginning of the much discussed chapter 112 of the Madchal, which is a work corresponding roughly in scope to Porphyry's Isagoge, Avicenna introduces a threefold distinction that holds of all quiddities. And he says that quiddities exist before multiplicity, in multiplicity, or after multiplicity. And he then explains that these three modes of existence amount respectively to existence in the intellection of God and the celestial intellects that for him are intermediaries in the chain of emanation. Second, in existence in concrete instantiations, which are potentially multiple, hence the multiplicity before, in, and after the quiddities exist. And then finally, existence in human minds. Text number 1 lays out, in the handout, lays out this general framework. I'm not going to read it, but it's there for you if you want to have a look. Now, Avicenna's point here, I think, is to lay the foundation for his theory of science. This foundation consists of the idea of pure quiddities, which, considered in abstraction from their three modes of existence and the accidents that are specific to each mode, are the immediate objects of our knowledge, and thereby provide a bridge between the mind and the world. This bridge stands on two pillars. First, the intelligible object in the mind corresponds to the essence in the experimental world by virtue of being identical in quiddity with it, albeit different in number and in mode of existence. And secondly, there's a causal connection between the experimental quiddity and the quiddity in the mind. The causal connection can hold both ways, but the one relevant to Avicenna's theory of science is obviously from the world to the mind. So the objects in the world cause the objects in the mind. To fulfill this epistemological function, the mentally existing quiddity must be devoid of any logical properties apart from its internal constitution. This is because we must be able to apply the same quiddity, both when we conceive an individual of a kind and when we conceive of a kind with many individuals. To put this another way, we must be able to conceive the quiddity as particular to one instantiation and as a universal shared by many instantiations. So we must be able to think of a human being and humanity by means of the same intelligible content. Thus, Avicenna thinks that the semantic relations of universality and particularity are additional concepts that the mind combines with a mentally existing quiddity. And this is something that he says in text number 2, which I am going to read with you. He says, the animal in itself is something that is conceived in the intellect as animal, and with respect to its being conceived as animal, it is nothing but animal. if it is therewith conceived as being common, specific, or other such, then another meaning, additional to its being animal and accidental to animality, has been conceived together with it. Likewise, animality becomes an indexical individual only by being conjoined with something that makes it indexical. In this manner, it is not such in the intellect, unless the intellect attaches to it a meaning that determines it. Moreover, being common does not come upon it as an accident externally, such that in reality it would be one essence, namely animal, but it has accidentally happened to it among external concrete things that it exists as itself in many. In the intellect, by contrast, it may accidentally happen to this animal form that is understood, that it is made to relate to many things, and this one, as itself, is validly predicated to a number of things that are conform under it by virtue of the fact that the intellect predicates it of each one of them. So the mentally existing quiddity is a universal concept if and only if the mind relates it to many referents, and by contrast, it is a particular concept if and only if the mind relates it to one determined referent. In the latter case, the determined reference must be indexical and provided by sense perception. This is, I think, in text number 3. He says, the individual only becomes an individual so that accidental properties, both those that are concomitant and those that are not, are attached to the nature of the species, and an indexical matter is determined for it. And then again, at the end of the passage, and this determination of an indexical matter to the content in the mind. That is through a perception that is like a sensation that indexically refers to it. That is like a sensation that indexically refers to such and such himself, an individual, or such and such time itself, the time at which that individual exists. Okay, what I have run you through now very quickly is one of the cornerstones of Avicenna's theory of knowledge. So knowledge consists of a valid referential relation that the mind conceives as holding between a concretely existing entity or entities, set of entities, and on the one hand, and then the intelligible concept existing in the mind on the other hand. The validity of this referential relation lies on the identity in quiddity between the mental content and its extramental referent. When the identity holds, the quiddity in the mind corresponds to the quiddity without the mind, and this is knowledge. The reason why I've started with such a detour through logic is that for Avicenna, the whole notion of mental existence is primarily epistemological. Of course, the concepts of mind, soul, or intellect are also employed in metaphysics and natural philosophy, but its main theoretical purpose, the main theoretical purpose of the concept of mental existence, is to establish this difference between two modes of existence for the same quiddities, and then to make sense of how that difference can be bridged such that knowledge is possible. The fact that mental existence is primarily an epistemological concept is corroborated by something Avicenna says in the 5th book of the Ilahiyat, or the metaphysics of this same larger work from which the text that we just had a look at is taken. Avicenna starts by elaborating on the concept of pure quiddity introduced in the logical context. To be able to serve as the bridge between concrete and mental existence, the quiddity must be neutral with respect to its mode of existence. To put this another way, it must not be a logical consequence of the constitution of the quiddity that it exists in one way or another, nor must either way of existence be ruled out by its constitution, so it must be neutral. Yet despite not being intrinsically determined to exist either concretely or mentally, any actual instantiation of a quiddity must exist in one way or another. There's no third option for Avicenna, and every actual quiddity is determined by extrinsic causes, to exist either concretely or in the mind. This is actually controversial. There's a recent book by Damian Janos which tries to make the claim that actually pure quiddities do have a third mode of existence. But yeah, as I said, that's controversial. I don't think we should enter there now unless you insist in the Q&A. Having said that, Avicenna states that the distinction between mental existence and concrete existence is not irreducible. Instead, he says that mental existence amounts to the concrete existence of a particular kind of entity, namely of a mind or a rational soul. So speaking of intelligible universals, Avicenna says, and this is text number 4, although this form is universal in relation to the individual, so the form existing in the mind, it is individual in relation to the particular soul in which it is impressed, being one of the forms in the intellect. Since individual souls are many in number, it is possible that this universal form is many in number in the respect that it is individual and there is another universal intelligible for it, the relation of which to it is like its relation to what is external, and which is distinguished in the soul from this form that is universal in relation to what is external by virtue of its being said of both this form and another. Okay, this is a complex formulation, but I think ultimately Avicenna's point is rather clear. So he's trying to say that the mentally existing quiddity is ultimately just a concretely existing quality of a concretely existing mind. And by concretely, I mean, well, not mentally, something that is part of the reality that is independent of whether it is thought by a mind. Concrete in this sense can also be incorporeal, which I think perhaps we wouldn't say is concrete in today's philosophical parlance. So the technical point he makes underlines precisely this claim, the technical point he makes in text number 4, namely that the quality of the individual mind, which functions as a universal concept in the thought of that mind, can in turn be an individual referent for another concept, such as the concept of concept. And in this sense, we can speak of, say, my concept of horse and your concept of horse as two numerically distinct things, even if they were identical in terms of their content. So each instance of mental existence is just ultimately, mental existence is reducible to concrete existence because each instance of mental existence is just a quality of a concretely existing mind. Now, to be able to function in this epistemological role of mental existence, the existence of an individual mind or an individual soul must have properties that distinguish it from the existence of other types of concrete thing. One such property is the intentionality of mental existence. To make its content refer to the world in a universal or a particular way, the mind must be capable of entertaining an intentional relation to the world. Another, arguably even more foundational property, however, is the mind's awareness of itself. Avicenna relies on self-awareness in many of the central arguments for his psychological substance dualism, yet he never gives us, at least as far as I know, a theory or any kind of explanation of this phenomenon. I think this may be because he holds it to be a primitive property of all incorporeal substances, including the human rational soul. He states in many places that incorporeal intellects, precisely by virtue of being incorporeal intellects, are engaged in constant intellection of themselves. And in several sections of the posthumously published collection of exchange known as the Talikat, which you could translate as appendices or comments, he spells out what this means for human rational souls. This is text number 5. It's actually consists of snippets from a much longer series of statements, but I think and there's a lot of repetition there. I think he's really trying to make a point in as clear terms as possible. But this is a selection. So he says, self-awareness is essential for the soul. It is not acquired from anything extrinsic. It is as if when the self occurs, awareness occurs with it. Its awareness of itself is absolute awareness. I mean that there is no condition whatsoever in it, and that it is constantly aware, not from time to time. Self-awareness is actual for the soul, so that it is constantly aware of itself. As regards awareness of awareness, it is potential. If awareness of awareness were actual, it would be constant and no consideration of the intellect would be needed for it. My perception of myself is something constitutive to me. It does not occur to me from a consideration of something else. When I say, I did such and such, I express my perception of myself, even if I were inattentive to my awareness of myself. For how else could I know that I did such and such if I did not first consider myself? Thus, I have first considered myself and then its act, and I have not considered anything by means of which I would have perceived myself. Our self-awareness is our very existence. And then at the end, self-awareness is innate to the self. It is the self's very existence. Hence, nothing extrinsic is needed by means of which to perceive the self, but instead, the self is that which perceives itself. It cannot exist without there being awareness of it, given that what is aware of it is identical to itself, not something else. So I think it's fair to say that this text is quite unambiguous. The mind is aware of itself innately, it does not need anything to acquire self-awareness. The mind's self-awareness does not depend on anything extrinsic to the mind. It is constant, it is not subject to development. And instead, the mind's very existence is its awareness of itself. And I guess we could say that the life of the mind at the most basic level according to Avicenna, amounts to being self-aware. I think this connects nicely to some of the talks we heard earlier today. The constancy of self-awareness is an important clue, I think, to what sort of phenomenon Avicenna has in mind. He appeals to this feature in distinguishing self-awareness in this foundational sense, in this very text, from the intermittent acts of reflective self-awareness, which he calls here awareness of awareness. This sort of reflection is an act of intellection which is turned upon the subject's prior activity. And this kind of reflective activity cannot be the most basic kind of self-awareness because it already presupposes acquaintance with the self. As Avicenna rhetorically asks, if a subject was not already aware of itself, how could it recognize the object of its reflective thought as a state of its own? So why should the act that I reflect upon, how can I think of it as my act unless I'm already somehow aware of myself, unless I have something in me by means of which I recognize the act as my own? So it's kind of a general argument against reflection-based models of self-awareness that Avicenna presents here. Now, I guess we can ask, what sense can we make of such a constant and innate self-awareness that is entirely immune to any kind of change or development? I've argued elsewhere, relying on further pieces of circumstantial evidence that I cannot engage with here, that the foundational and analytically primitive kind of self-awareness should be understood as simply denoting the fact that each of us exists as an I, or in the first person. For Avicenna, the fact that we live, act, and experience in the first person is an essential constituent of our being. That Avicenna's concept of self-awareness amounts to first personality is corroborated by the witness of readers who were historically closer to him. I think quite unanimously, this is how he was read. But one particularly prominent case is the 12th century thinker Shihabuddin Suhrawardi. Somewhat in passing, Suhrawardi puts forth the interesting idea, a further idea, that self-awareness actually lays the foundation for another central property of mental existence, namely the fact that it has an intentional structure, in which the self-aware subject is related to an object that it cognizes, and that it cognizes as distinct from itself. As Suhrawardi puts it, I quote, "What is not aware of itself cannot be aware of another." To my knowledge, Avicenna never states quite as explicitly that intentional awareness of an object depends on the subject's prior awareness of herself, but there are reasons to think that he would have agreed with Suhrawardi. One such reason we can find in Avicenna's consistent rejection of the view, which he denigratingly attributes to Porphyry, that the subject and object are one in an act of cognition. We could call this a unity theory or identity theory of cognition. Although Avicenna accepts this unity theory in the case of intellects that are superior to ours, like those celestial intellects or perhaps the mind of God, he believes it is absurd in any type of human cognition, and it's absurd on very basic phenomenological grounds. Text 6 is his argument from NAFS, the psychological section of the same larger work that we've been looking at so far. He says, what is said about the soul itself becoming the intelligible things that it understands is altogether something I take to be impossible. I do not get their saying that a thing becomes something else, nor do I understand how that would take place. If it took place by divesting one form and then putting on another form, being one thing with the first form and another thing with the other form, then the first thing would not really become the second thing. Instead, the first thing would have perished and only its subject or a part of it would remain. And then he treats at some greater length this idea and sums the discussion up by saying towards the end of this passage, this is nonsense. Instead, the soul is the one that has intellection, and intellection means either the soul's potency through which it has intellection or the forms of the intelligible things in themselves. But since they are intelligible because they are in the soul, intellection, the one that has intellection, and that which is intelligible are not one and the same thing in our souls. Yes, this can happen in something else, in other cases, as you will see in its proper place. But in the case of human souls, the subject, the object, and the act of thinking, the intentional relation between those two are three different things. So the unity theory of cognition, according to Avicenna, is wrong because it is irreconcilable with the undeniable experiential fact that as subjects of cognitive experience, we retain our identity despite the variation of the cognitive content or the intentional objects of our experience. If the unity theory were true, then each new experience would be a new mental entity. When I think about a horse, I would be a different thing. Well, it would be a different I thinking about a horse as opposed to a thought about cats, let's say. I mean, if the subject really were identical with the object, then the thought about horses and the thought about cats would necessarily belong to different subjects. But I think, yeah, Avicenna thinks that this is clearly absurd. We have undeniable phenomenological evidence of retaining our identity from one thought to another. So instead, Avicenna holds that the subject persists throughout the change in a way analogical to the persistence of the hylomorphic material substrate that underlies the change of forms in concrete hylomorphic substances. The difference between the two cases is, of course, that unlike the material substrate, which is purely potential in itself, the cognitive subject's identity is that of an actual substance, albeit one endowed with the potency to new acts of cognition. As we saw from text 5, the actual existence of the subject consists of its innate and immutable self-awareness. In this sense, self-awareness can be considered a necessary condition for the rational soul's intentional awareness of cognitive objects. At the same time, Avicenna's rejection of the unity theory entails that at least the existence of human minds has an inherent intentional structure. Being aware of itself, the subject is thereby innately aware of anything else as other than itself, or as an object of its experience. Interestingly, Avicenna suggests that this intentional structure is specific to the human mind, and due to its deficiency in comparison to the superior celestial and divine intellects. To my knowledge, he doesn't really elaborate this point, this difference, at any great length, but it seems that the deficiency is due to the inherent potentiality of the human mind, or the lack of innate intelligible content in human minds. And it is this inherent potentiality that gives rise to our intellectual development, as well as the fact that our experience is prone to constantly move from one content to another, instead of statically contemplating the intellectual content of which its own being consists, like in the case of the intellects superior to us. So this intrinsic intentional structure of human mental existence, or the fact that mental existence consists of a subject cognizing an object that is distinct from the subject, is complemented by another intentional relation, namely the referential relation between the mental content, the intrinsically to which the subject is related, has this intrinsic intentional relation. So this mental content, and then its extramental correlate that we encountered in the logical discussion concerning universality and particularity. We can also find this relation, which we might call extrinsic intentionality, in the distinction between the foundational epistemological concepts of conception, or tasawwur in Arabic, and assent, tasdiq, which Avicenna adopts from Abu Nasr al-Farabi, his predecessor. This distinction between conception and assent, which is central to the theory of knowledge of both thinkers, holds between mental content that is entirely neutral with regard to truth value and merely consists in the entertaining of an object of thought, this is conception, and then between content that is taken to be true or false of a referent that is distinct from the immediate mental content. This is an act of assent. The first kind of content is merely conceived, whereas the second kind is a conceived content to which one gives or withholds one's assent, which one takes to be true or false. So assent, thus, we can say, concerns the extrinsic intentional relation between an intrinsic intentional object and its referent. And it is due to a second-order conception concerning the truth or falsity of the first-order conception. This distinction between two types of intentional relation raises the question of what prompts us to perceive the intrinsic intentional objects of our experience to have an extrinsic intentional relation to the world outside of our experience. I don't have a sort of a comprehensive answer here, but I think elements, for one, can be found in Avicenna's discussion of the different kinds of proposition to which we are both prone and warranted to assent without any argumentative grounds. His list of such propositions, which he seems to draw on pragmatic grounds, is quite liberal, and it includes cases that are epistemologically clearly vulnerable, such as assent to reliable witness reports, or to theoretical propositions that are based on nothing but frequent experience. So sort of something quite close to induction. And this list was actually trimmed down by later authors. And if we take a brief look at some of the cases that the later authors took to be less controversial, it might prove illuminating for our purposes. And there's especially one case that is of interest to us. Next to rather evident cases that our intellect takes to be analytically true, such as the sentences like the whole is greater than the part, or 2 is the half of 4, Avicenna mentions propositions that are based on immediate sense perception or immediate proprioception, like sentences like this tree is green or I have a headache. Since Avicenna believed that propositions of this kind always have existential import, positive affirmative propositions always have existential import for Avicenna, we can take these sentences as equivalent with sentences like there's a green tree here or I exist and I have a headache. Because nothing in the intelligible concept of such sentences can make us prone to assent to them, or can explain our inclination to assent to them. The power that these propositions have of drawing assent from us must be due to the fact that they are based on an experience of immediate perception. And if this is correct, then it seems that perceptual experiences either entail extrinsic intentionality or very strongly incline us to conceive of their content as referring to the extramental world. Now, I think this can be developed into a coherent view that provides us a comprehensive explanation of why assent is produced in us, why this extrinsic intentional relation holds between some mental states and the extramental world. I can't provide that comprehensive account here, but I think it will have to do with it will revolve on a peculiar kind of causal power that sense perception has on us and on our mental life. So to wrap up the foregoing, I have argued that mental existence has 3 properties. It is aware of itself. Secondly, it is intentionally structured, which I've been calling intrinsic intentional. It has an intrinsic intentional structure. And then third, it is intentionally related to the world. It has this extrinsic kind of intentionality. Now, Avicenna also endorses a representationalist explanation of this property of intentionality. This is in text number 7. I'm not going to read it. It's a fairly uncontroversial part of Avicenna's psychology, that he is a representationalist. We could find plenty of other texts as evidence for this, but the point is that the fact that the mind's cognitive qualities are representations of extramental things the fact that the mind's cognitive qualities are representations of extramental things was already, of course, implied by the epistemological function of mental existence and the related notion of correspondence, what we started with. So unlike self-awareness and intentionality, representationality is not really a structural property of the mind's experience, but it's rather a model for explaining the metaphysical underpinnings of intentionality. The cognitive system's capacity to represent things external to it is a central idea to Avicenna's cognitive psychology, and he endorses representationalism across the board, from sense perception to intellection. In the case of sub-intellectual cognition, however, representation takes place by means of corporeal faculties of cognition that are located either in the sense organs or in the brain. And as we will now see, Avicenna's commitment to representationalism gives rise to 2 quite serious problems, or perhaps even aporiae, that his critical readers were quick to point out. The first of these problems concerns representationalism and its epistemological function in general, while the second is particular to the role of representation in sub-intellectual cognition. This general aporia is presented in many contexts by Avicenna's most dedicated critic, the late 12th century theologian Fakhruddin Razi. The idea is quite straightforward. Consider the quiddity of a substance, like a horse, the ubiquitous Avicennian example. When the quiddity exists extramentally, It exists as the formal part of a substance, which means that the quiddity is a substance that exists, as the technical phrase goes, not in a subject. By contrast, when transferred to mental existence, the quiddity exists as a quality of the mind, and therefore in the mind, or in a subject, and as an accident. Now, Fakhruddin Razi asks, how can a quiddity change its highest genus from substance to quality? This would involve a change in its constitution, which is fatal to the idea of identity in quiddity that was supposed to provide the foundation of Avicenna's epistemology. By the same token, since the mentally existing horse is not a substance, it cannot be a body, that is an extended substance, and consequently it cannot have any of the corporeal properties that are characteristic of individual horses. As a consequence, not only the identity of constitution, but even the phenomenological similarities between mentally existing horses and real horses will be lost. And for Razi, all of this signals the absurdity of the concept of mental existence and provides an impetus to pursue direct realism as the alternative to Avicenna's representationalism. The problem, however, that Razi lays out here was not invented by him or by any of Avicenna's later critics, because there are signs that it was actually discussed within Avicenna's immediate circle. Now, if we look at the following report, or text number 8 from the Taliqat, we can see that Avicenna actually tries to meet this challenge. Text number 8 goes, the meaning of his statement, this interestingly, it's clearly not Avicenna himself speaking, this is a report perhaps by one of his students or one of the people in his immediate circle. But I think we can take this as an Avicennian idea. So the meaning of his statement, the quiddity of a substance is a substance, is that a substance exists among concrete things, not in a subject, and this attribute exists for it. When the soul understands this attribute of it, only the intelligible and the meaning of its quiddity obtain of it in the soul, not the quiddity itself. Regardless of whether its quiddity is among concrete things or in the soul understands of the quiddity that it exists among concrete things, not in a subject. It is not the case that when it is in the soul or in the intellect in a subject, this judgment becomes false of it, and it does not come to be a quiddity that is not in a subject among concrete things. It is like the magnetic stone and iron. I believe the point of the answer is that the constitutive and concomitant features of mentally existing quiddities should be understood under a modal qualification. Mental quiddities are such that if they existed extramentally, then they would have these features that we take to be constitutive to them. This is exemplified by the somewhat strange, perhaps, analogy with the magnetic stone, the magnetic powers of which are purely dispositional, or can be purely dispositional in some context. Although the magnet may appear as a perfectly ordinary rock if you hold it in your palm, it is still the case that if you brought it into the vicinity of iron particles, its power of attraction would become manifest. And this is precisely what its being a magnet amounts to. So by the same token, the quiddity that is in the mind is identical to the quiddity that is extramental only under this modal qualification. If it existed extramentally, then it would have the same constitutive properties as the extramental quiddity. Now, one might think that this solution is attractive, but it's clearly not free from difficulties. To begin with, it's clearly quite ad hoc and void of explanatory power, because it seems very difficult, if not impossible, to make sense of these modally qualified properties of mental existing quiddities without appealing to their extramental correlates. Even worse, instead of salvaging the initially strong notion of identity in quiddity that we could perhaps rely on as bridging the mind to the world, the modal solution ends up compromising it. If the modally qualified constitutive properties of the mentally existing quiddity are parasitic on the reference to the quiddity's extramental correlate, then the identity in quiddity between the two becomes trivial, for any content of the mind could be taken to represent any extramental quiddity, as long as we conceive of that content such that if it existed extramentally, it would have the properties of the quiddity we intend to represent. So unless we can somehow account of the modally qualified properties of the mentally existing quiddity in some way independent of the correlate properties of the extramental quiddity, unless we can do that, then it seems fair to say that although Avicenna's solution may save the consistency of his theory, it does so at the cost of any explanatory power that the theory may have had. So it's an empty solution. So that's one problem. Another equally serious problem emerges from our cognition of corporeal objects. Now, if the mind is incorporeal, as Avicenna believes it is, then it seems that many properties of extramental things, like their spatial properties, for instance, cannot be represented in the mind immediately. How could an incorporeal mind have any qualities that depend on corporeality? Avicenna recognizes this, and in fact, he actually appeals to the observation as evidence for the corporeality of our faculty of imagination. In arguing for the corporeality of imagination, he asks us to imagine three adjacent squares as pictured in figure F1 in the handout. I stole this picture from Fazlur Rahman's translation of another psychological work of Avicenna's. I hope he doesn't mind. But if you look at this picture, then evidently the two smaller squares, EAGF and BKLM, are numerically distinct, despite the fact that they have exactly the same dimensions, because they're distinct because they are posited on different sides of the large square ABDC. And equally evidently, the difference in position between the smaller squares is not due to their shared quiddity. For one quiddity cannot entail two mutually exclusive concomitants, such as being to the right of ABDC and being to the left of it. The two smaller squares are squares in one and the same sense. So Avicenna concludes that the distinction must be due to the substrate in which the three squares exist. That is either an extramental material substrate, like the paper on which the figure is drawn, or our faculty of imagination, as in the initial thought experiment. Even the intellect's concepts to the left of and to the right of only make sense in relation to such prior distinctness. So for Avicenna, our capacity to think about these three squares provides evidence for the fact that imagination actually relies on the brain to perform its functions. This geometrical organization actually must exist in the brain for us to be able to think it. Avicenna's argument suggests that extended objects can only be represented in a corporeal organ, and that at least some objects of perceptual cognition cannot exist in the mind. So consequently, mental existence does not completely overlap with conscious experience, because the latter includes such corporeally represented objects, among other things. And yet, despite the fact that that sub-intellectual cognition is corporeal or relies on corporeal organs, Avicenna is adamant that it is one and the same soul that is aware of both perceptual and intelligible objects. And in fact, he may have been one of the first to present an explicit version of the argument that Kant later called the Achilles of rationalist psychology. As he puts it in Nafs 5.7, this is text number 9, it has become clear that the different acts of the soul belong to different faculties, and that each faculty, insofar as it is a faculty, is like that only insofar as the primary act belonging to it emerges from it. Hence, the irascible faculty is not affected by pleasures, nor the appetitive faculty by pains. And what has an effect upon these two has no effect upon the faculty of perception, nor is either of these two, insofar as they are what they are, receptive to or informed by the perceived form. Once this matter is settled, we say that these faculties must have a nexus, a connection that joins them all together and to which they are conjoined. This is why it is correct for us to say, since we sensed, we desired, and since we saw such and such, we became angry. And then slightly later, having argued that this nexus, which is the subjectivity that we talked about earlier, the fact that these different kinds of experiences, different modes of experiences are all experienced by the same subject. Once he's argued that this nexus of subjectivity cannot be any corporeal organ or the body as a whole, Avicenna then concludes, text number 10, That organ on its own is not the thing that I'm aware of as being me essentially. Instead, it is me accidentally. What is intended in my acquaintance with myself that I am me, and what I mean when I say I sensed, I understood, I acted, and I joined these attributes together is something else, and it is that which I call I. So it's the same subject that experiences these different kinds of things. How then do objects of sense perception figure in the experience of an incorporeal mind? The closest that Avicenna comes to answering this question is when he says that although percepts do not strictly speaking exist in the mind has access to them as part of its governing relation to the body. Now look at the following text, again from the posthumous Talikad, and this is thankfully the last text I have, text number 11. He says, perception only belongs to the soul, and only sensing the sense thing and being affected upon by it belong to the sense faculty, which is corporeal. Evidence of this is that the sense faculty may be affected by what is sensed, yet the soul is inattentive, and the thing is neither sensed nor perceived. When the soul does not perceive the sense thing, this is because the soul is distracted from it by a thought or some inadvertence, and although the sense thing may obtain in the common sense, one of the faculties of the soul, one of the corporeal faculties, the common sense cannot perform its function for the soul, or because the soul occupies the common sense with what it is devoted to, and what is sensed is not impressed upon the common sense. So Avicenna says here that the physiological processes underlying sense perception and ultimately caused by the excremental objects remain unconscious and only become perceptual experiences when the incorporeal mind attends to those processes. It is as if when the mind has to share its attention between its own activity of intellection and observing the processes in the different cognitive organs of the body, and then the content of experience is determined by where the attentive gaze happens to land at any particular time. According to this model, if the perceptual objects can be represented in the cognitive organs, the mind can perceive them by observing those organs. This kind of model may seem to save Avicenna from the problem of having corporeal things represented in the incorporeal mind, but it is not free from difficulties either. And post-Avicennian authors came up with several examples designed to show the absurdity of such a view. One frequent case comes from the ancient debates in optics. How can excremental objects that are vastly discrepant in size to the human organ, such as a mountain, be replicated in the eye or the brain? Another hard case was constituted by objects of other sense modalities, like touch or smell. Is the brain hot in the part in which fire is represented, or does it smell of roses or taste like licorice when such sensations take place? Problems of this sort could perhaps be solved in a way analogous to Avicenna's postulation of modally qualified mental equivalents for the excremental properties. Perhaps the representations in the cognitive organs of the body do not have to replicate the phenomenal properties of excremental objects, as long as each distinct property has a distinct representation of some kind. Along these lines, John McGuinness and Deborah Black, at least among others, have suggested that the representations of perceived objects are bits of coded information that are produced in the organ of perception and then carried on by the vital spirit in the nerves and the brain. To use McGuinness's characterization of the idea, the representations can be understood as electrochemical charges that our mind then decodes and ends up perceiving intentional objects that are considerably like the excremental things and properties that initially caused the charge transmission process. This interpretation is quite attractive, and the idea was certainly in the air in Avicenna's time. Not quite in McGuinness's terms, but there's something quite similar to it. The great optician Ibn Haytham's theory, Ibn Haytham was a contemporary of Avicenna, he had a theory of how light impulses are transformed into information which the nerves can transmit, and that how the brain can then infer the visual object with all its properties based on the slight variations in that information. That's quite similar to Avicenna. Or to McGuinness's interpretation of Avicenna. And by the same token, Avicenna himself says in passing that many of the perceived properties of excremental objects are not strictly speaking sensed, but inferred by the soul's cognitive faculties based on variations in sense data. So it's not, although it might seem anachronistic, the interpretation, we can clearly find materials both in Avicenna and other contemporary authors that show that it's not necessarily so. But philosophically, even though this solution might have some initial promise, it suffers from one fatal problem. The decoded information obviously is supposed to consist of precisely those properties that Avicenna recognized as incompatible with the incorporeality of mental existence. So to put this another way, if both the attention model of perception and the coding interpretation of representation are correct, we should be perceiving series of electric charges in the nerves and the brain, or something along those lines, instead of the source of substance-like objects that we do perceive. So it doesn't really solve the problem in the end. Now, much as I'm inclined to act as Avicenna's advocate, the two problems, I think, seem genuine aporia within his system. And in their light, it's easy to sympathize with Razi's rejection of mental existence and representationalism altogether. Obviously, his own solution is not without problems of its own, but that's another story. There was also another way of biting the bullet that we can find in post-Avicennian Islamic philosophy. For instance, the early 17th century thinker Sadruddin al-Shirazi, better known perhaps as Mullah Sadra, held that an incorporeal mind is capable of entertaining extended objects that have all the properties of corporeal substances. So he tried to broaden the notion of mental existence to include these features of perceptual experience. But how exactly he treated with the seemingly irreconcilable properties of such objects, or indeed whether he managed to do so in any satisfactory way, I think require further investigation. I've overstayed my welcome altogether already, so thank you for your patience.